Good evening all, and welcome back to our channel. If you've lived long enough, you already know this. The quietest places often hide the loudest horrors. The small towns where nothing ever happens until something does. Something no one wants to talk about. Something people bury under generations of fear and silence. But silence doesn't erase the past. It only makes it darker. And tonight, we're digging into the shadows of Canada's most unsettling true stories, where hauntings, mysteries, and human cruelty collided in ways the towns still whisper about. These aren't campfire tales. These are real accounts documented by witnesses, police, newspapers, and entire communities. Cases where families vanished, spirits refused to rest, and violence carved scars into places that still haven't healed. If you think you know Canadian history, wait until you hear what small towns have desperately tried to forget. Before we start this journey into the unexplained and the unforgiven, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss our deep dives into real horror stories from around the world. And if you've got a creepy tale from your hometown, drop it in the comments. You might hear it in a future episode. Now, turn down the lights, because once we begin, you'll never look at small towns the same way again. In the quiet town of Amherst, Nova Scotia, the year 1878 lives on in the kind of whispers that never quite fade. People still speak of it with a careful pause, as though the memory itself might stir something awake. The Great Amherst Mystery, as it came to be known, began without spectacle, without thunder or warning, without any sign at all that the most disturbing and bewildering haunting in Canadian history was about to unfold in a modest wood frame house on Princess Street. Life was ordinary in the tiny town. Amherst was a place of slow rhythms and predictable days, where people worked hard, minded their neighbors, and held tightly to their faith as protection against a world that still felt large, wild, and uncertain. It was in this unassuming place that a young woman named Esther Cox lived with her sister Olive and Olive's husband, Daniel Teed. Esther was quiet, polite, and known to be shy, the sort of person who made an impression only by her gentleness. No one could have predicted that her name would one day circle the globe, attached to a story so baffling that even the scientific minds of the era struggled to explain it. The disturbance began after a traumatic event shook Esther's world to its core. She had been threatened at gunpoint by a man she knew, an incident that left her terrified but alive. In the days that followed, she spoke little about it, keeping her pain folded tightly inside her. But trauma has a way of moving in the dark, waiting for a moment to surface. And hers surfaced not in tears or trembling, but in a phenomenon that no one in the house nor in the town of Amherst could ever forget. It started with noises. At first, they were subtle, faint rustlings, quiet tappings, the kind of small disturbances a house might make as it settles. But these were rhythmic, intentional. Listening closely, the family realized the taps were not random, they were responses. You could ask a question and something, whatever it was, would answer. One tap for yes, and poor yes. Two taps for no. The strange intelligence behind the sounds terrified those who heard them, but the noises were only the beginning. One night, Esther awoke with a scream. Her sisters rushed to her bedside, only to find her eyes wide with terror and her body shaking uncontrollably. She whispered hoarsely that something was crawling under the blankets with her. When her sisters threw back the cover, they saw the fabric moving, lifting, rippling as though unseen hands were pushing from beneath. The blankets twisted on their own, nodding and unknodding in full view of the family. Esther, pale and trembling, could only stare. From that moment, the disturbances grew in intensity and boldness. Footsteps echoed in empty rooms. Loud bangs shook the walls, rattling dishes and sending neighbors running to check on the family. Furniture slid across the floor with no visible cause. Sometimes objects flew, not drifted, not toppled, flew. A water jug hurled itself against a wall and shattered, the pieces scattering across the floor as though thrown by an angry hand. Doctors were called, clergy were summoned. Men of science, men of faith, ordinary townsfolk, All of them tried to make sense of the impossible occurrences. And yet, whenever Esther was in the room, the activity intensified, as though she were both the target and the channel for whatever force had taken hold of the house. Some believed she was possessed. Others believed the haunting was an external spirit tormenting her. A few suspected fraud, until they saw the events with their own eyes. If Esther was orchestrating a trick, she was surpassingly skilled at it, and her motives, if deception was her goal, made no sense at all. She gained no joy from the phenomena, no fame that improved her life, no fortune that benefited her. Instead, she suffered. The knocks and bangs terrified her. The sudden jolts of temperature left her shivering or gasping for breath. Sometimes she felt hands gripping her, invisible hands that left bruises on her skin. The family insisted they witnessed these marks appear out of nowhere. The investigation deepened when a local man, an upholsterer named John Teed, invited others to witness the events. He wanted proof. He wanted clarity. And he got more than he bargained for. In a room filled with people, with Esther seated in full view, heavy furniture suddenly rose an inch from the floor and dropped. A box of cloth slid itself across a table. A spool of thread lifted, hovered, and then shot across the room like a bullet. The witnesses were too shocked to speak. Word spread. Newspapers took interest. Reporters traveled to Amherst, hoping for a sensational story. And they got one, but not the kind that could be easily sensationalized. How do you write a coherent article about events that defy every rule of nature? The journalists tried their best. Some called it a haunting. Others called it hysteria. A few insisted it was the devil's work. But the accounts, however varied, all agreed on one thing. Something extraordinary was happening in that small town. The spirit, or whatever force animated the house, eventually took to communicating in writing. Using charcoal, it scrawled messages on walls and objects. The handwriting often appeared suddenly, in places that had been clean and blank moments before. Some messages threatened Esther, some made demands, some were crude, angry, and malevolent. The entity seemed to shift in personality, one moment childlike, the next violent, the next almost mockingly playful. When Esther's suffering worsened, she was sent to stay with other relatives in hopes that the disturbances would cease. They did not. Wherever she went, the phenomenon followed. At one point, scratches appeared on her skin as though carved by invisible claws. Another time, she was thrown from her bed with such force that the people in the house rushed to restrain her, fearing she might break bones. They found her suspended half a foot above the mattress, her back arched, her body taut like a bowstring. The local community was divided. Some believed Esther entirely. Others whispered that she invited the devil into the town. A few found the entire affair an embarrassment to Amherst. But none could ignore the evidence, because too many people had witnessed things no human could explain. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred when spontaneous fires began erupting around Esther. Pieces of cloth, stacks of paper, household items, they would suddenly begin to smoke, then ignite into flame. People scrambled to extinguish them, but the fires kept appearing one after another. There was no source of heat, no kindling, no rational cause. The family lived in constant fear of a blaze that could burn the house down. By now, word of the haunting had traveled far beyond Nova Scotia. The story made its way into American newspapers, British publications, and spiritualist journals. Amherst was no longer an obscure small town. It had become a name associated with the supernatural, with mystery, with fear. Curious visitors flocked to the house. Some hoped to disprove the story. Others hoped to witness the paranormal firsthand. Many left unsettled, changed, or completely convinced. Among the more serious investigators was Walter Hubble, an actor and researcher who spent months living in the Teed household documenting the phenomena. He witnessed dozens of events, levitations, knocks, violent shaking, and the strange behavior of Esther during episodes. He published a book on the case, describing the terrors in vivid detail. His account helped cement the Great Amherst Mystery as one of the most thoroughly documented poltergeist cases of the 19th century. Throughout the ordeal, Esther remained at the center of the storm, fearful, exhausted, and emotionally worn. She was not a medium by choice. She was not someone seeking attention. If anything, she seemed desperate for normalcy, begging the unseen force to leave her alone. At times, she even contemplated leaving Amherst altogether to escape the torment. But poverty and circumstance kept her tethered to the town, where the dark chapters of her story continued to unfold. Eventually, the phenomena began to wane. Whether the entity grew tired, or Esther's inner strength returned, or the trauma that fed the disturbances softened, no one could say. The knocks grew quieter, the sudden movements of objects became less frequent, the fires stopped. Esther experienced long stretches of calm, broken only occasionally by mild incidents. The house itself seemed to exhale, the oppressive tension lifting little by little. By the early 1880s, the haunting had all but ceased. Esther moved on with her life, though she never fully outran the shadow the events had cast over her. She married, had children, and attempted to carve out a normal existence. But people remembered. Some refused to speak to her. Others watched her with suspicion. A few remained sympathetic, believing she had survived something unimaginable. Her story lingered in the collective memory of the town long after the last knock faded. The mystery never found a satisfying explanation. Skeptics claimed hysteria. Believers swore it was supernatural. Doctors suggested psychological trauma. Clergy spoke of spiritual oppression. Each explanation held pieces of truth, yet none could fully account for the hundreds of documented witnesses who reported seeing furniture move, fires burst into flame, and messages appear without human hands. Time, as it often does, softened the edges of fear, leaving behind a legend, one that continues to intrigue researchers, historians, paranormal investigators, and storytellers. The house on Princess Street no longer stands as it once did. The people who lived through the events have long since passed, but the legacy of the Great Amherst Mystery persists like a faint echo, a tap on the wall of Canada's past that refuses to be silenced. Even now, the questions remain. Was the haunting a manifestation of Esther's unspoken trauma, a psychological storm so powerful it spilled into the physical world? Was it the work of an external entity, one that latched onto her vulnerability and used it as a doorway? Or was it something else entirely, a phenomenon beyond human understanding, glimpsed only briefly before disappearing into the quiet corridors of memory? Whatever the truth, the Great Amherst Mystery endures. It is a story that invites wonder and dread in equal measure, a haunting woven not just into the walls of a long-gone house, but into the very identity of a small Canadian town. And it reminds us, even today, that the most disturbing horrors are not always loud or violent. Sometimes they begin with a whisper, a tap, a faint, inexplicable sound in the night that signals the beginning of something no one is prepared to face. There are stories that settle themselves deep into the land, stories that cling to the soil and the timber and the fading memories of the people who once stood close enough to feel the heat of something they could not explain. In rural Nova Scotia, the land remembers everything, and in the early 1920s it remembered something so unnerving, so relentless, and so destructive that even today, the echo of it hangs over the abandoned clearings of Caledonia Mills. People call it the Fire Spook, because no name has ever captured the chaos any better than that. The story begins with a family like so many others of their time, hard-working, deeply private, and accustomed to wrestling a living from the rough land outside Antigonish. Their farmhouse was modest but sturdy, a place built for survival rather than beauty, and it stood alone enough that visitors were rare. In that quiet isolation lived the MacDonald family, father, mother, and their adopted daughter, Mary Ellen. They were the kind of people who minded their own affairs and trusted that others would do the same, the kind of people who didn't stir gossip. But gossip eventually came to them because something had intruded into their home, something restless and fiery and unpredictable. Before the fires began, the disturbances were merely strange. Small objects misplaced themselves, either without telling or without memory. Footsteps creaked across floors when everyone was seated. Doors opened on their own, not quickly, but slowly, deliberately, as though pushed by a hand that wanted to be noticed. Usually, these were the sorts of things a family would dismiss or blame on drafts or perhaps on forgetfulness. But even in those early days, the McDonalds felt a slight tension in the air, an unseen pressure that raised the hairs on the back of the neck. It was as though the house itself was listening.
Yeah!
Mary Ellen, the teenage daughter, was present for most of these incidents, and at times seemed frightened by them. She was quiet and withdrawn, a girl who carried the weight of something unsaid. Some neighbors later claimed that she seemed troubled long before the disturbances began. Others insisted that whatever plagued the McDonald house had fixed itself on her for reasons beyond human understanding. In that community, where explanations were scarce and superstition was a loyal companion, it didn't take long for whispers to grow. But nothing, not the footsteps, not the cold spots, not the odd behavior of objects, prepared the family for the moment the fires began. It was small at first, a patch of cloth smoldering on the floor with no source nearby. The family rushed to stamp it out, confused but believing it accidental. But then another fire appeared, and another, and another, and another. Some ignited on the walls, others on bedding, others on books and small bundles of cloth stored for mending. Fires erupted even when the family stood, watch, their eyes moving from one object to the next, trying desperately to keep ahead of the sparks. And still, flames rose as though summoned by thought. Panic set in as the fires continued. There were more than 30 on the first notable day alone, each one threatening the house, each one extinguished only through frantic effort. The McDonalds, exhausted and frightened beyond words, had no explanations. Their home, once a place of security, had transformed into something alive with danger, as though the building itself had turned against them. Neighbors, summoned by alarm, saw the aftermath. They walked through the house and found scorch marks in places that defied reason. They studied the charred remains of objects that should not have caught fire on their own. The family had no oil lamps overturned, no faulty stove, no exposed flame or spark. The fires made no sense. And because they made no sense, talk of the supernatural began to sharpen into certainty. The region was no stranger to strange tales. Nova Scotia, with its long history of maritime folklore and ghostly storytelling, had cultivated a reputation for things unseen. But even in that place, the fire spook stood out as something unprecedented. When the phenomena became too alarming to ignore, external investigators arrived. Journalists, clergy, police officers, all of them were drawn by the spectacle of a house that seemed to burn from the inside out without any earthly cause. Curious crowds gathered on the McDonald's land, despite the family's growing discomfort with the attention. People wanted to witness the impossible. Some got what they came for. On more than one occasion, observers claimed to see fires begin before their very eyes. A patch of hay would ignite without friction. A cloth hanging on a nail would burst into flame. A wooden wall would darken, smoke, and then flicker with fire despite no heat source being near it. Several witnesses swore that Mary Ellen herself emitted strange static-like noises when the phenomena peaked, as though the air around her carried electricity. Some said her eyes seemed distant and unfocused, that she looked like someone trapped inside her own life. It became difficult to separate truth from rumor. Reports varied wildly, but one constant remained: the fires did not stop. Eventually, the authorities stepped in. The family was compelled to leave the property temporarily, and the house was observed under controlled conditions. Even then, fires broke out. Even when both the family and outsiders watched every possible source of ignition, the flames appeared in places no match could reach. Investigators were baffled. Some believed it was a hoax, that perhaps the family was setting the fires themselves for attention or sympathy, but no clear motive presented itself, and no one caught the family in the act. Others believed it was a case of poltergeist activity linked to Mary Ellen, a troubled young woman whose emotional distress might have made her susceptible to something unexplained. A few, particularly those with deep roots in local superstition, believed something older than the family had awakened, something tied to the land or the house or to Mary Ellen herself in ways too ancient to unravel. Skeptics attempted to disprove the supernatural angle. They pointed to possible chemical accelerants, to the chance of embers or sparks unseen by witnesses, to the possibility of fraud. But testimony from dozens of people complicated such explanations. The fire spook had shown itself too publicly, too repeatedly, and too dramatically to dismiss without consideration. Some villagers grew uneasy with the attention the case brought. They feared what the presence of outsiders might stir up. Others feared the entity itself, whatever it was. They kept their distance from the farmhouse, whispering prayers as they passed. Stories spread of strange animal behavior near the property. Cattle refusing to graze, dogs barking at empty corners, horses shying as though sensing something invisible. Whether these stories were true or expanded in retelling, they fed the growing legend of the fire spook. The family's suffering reached its peak when the fires intensified beyond small patches and began threatening the structural integrity of the house. Walls blackened, ceilings scorched, the smell of smoke lingered constantly in the air. The McDonalds slept in shifts to keep watch. They lived in ongoing fear of losing everything, including their own lives. In the midst of that terror, one chilling pattern emerged. The fires were most active when Mary Ellen was present and least active when she was absent. This fact fueled speculation that she was the focus of the entity's energy, whether as a victim or as an unconscious participant. Some believed that if she left the house permanently, the fires would end. But sending a young girl away into the world under a cloud of suspicion and fear was not an easy decision, nor was it one the family took lightly. Eventually, the situation became untenable. The McDonalds agreed to leave the house under supervision, hoping that by removing themselves from the environment, the disturbances would stop. And they did, almost immediately. Without the family inside, the house fell silent. No fires, no noises, no strange movements. The silence was so complete that investigators found themselves unnerved, not by what they heard, but by what they didn't. This sudden lull further convinced observers that the phenomenon was tied to the presence of the McDonalds, and more specifically to Mary Ellen. Yet even then, no one could determine whether the cause was supernatural, psychological, or fraudulent. Too many witnesses had seen too much. When the family returned, the fires reignited again. And again, Mary Ellen was always nearby. Eventually, the pressure, the attention, and the terror forced a final separation. Mary Ellen left the home. Accounts differ on where she went. Some say she was taken in by relatives, others that she was placed in a more structured environment where she could escape the emotional turbulence of the farmhouse. What is known is that once she was gone, the fires ceased completely. The house fell quiet. It became just another dwelling on the rough Nova Scotia land, its mysteries sealed temporarily behind its walls. The McDonalds, however, did not return to the life they had known. The stigma accompanied them in every interaction. The community regarded them with a mixture of pity and wariness. They were the family the fires had pursued. They were the ones who had lived inside a mystery no one could decipher. As for Mary Ellen, history says little. She seemed to disappear from record, absorbed into the flow of life somewhere else. Some believed that removing her from the house saved her. Others believed that wherever she went, the strange energy may have followed. Still others believed she had been the epicenter of the storm, and that the storm ended when she found distance. Whatever the truth, the question of her involvement remained unanswered. In the years that followed, the fire spook became a local legend. Investigators revisited the case. Paranormal researchers attempted to connect the events to patterns seen in other poltergeist cases, suggesting that the focus on an adolescent girl was common in many such accounts. Skeptics continued to argue that fraud or misinterpretation was the real culprit. Theories battled each other, but none fully defeated the others. The story endured because it offered no easy answers. Those who believed the events were supernatural saw in the fire spook the raw presence of something otherworldly, perhaps malevolent, perhaps chaotic, but undeniably real. Those who believed in psychological explanations saw the fires as manifestations of deep turmoil in Mary Ellen's life, perhaps expressed unconsciously through actions she herself could not understand. Those who believed in deliberate fraud pointed to the convenience of the family's claims and the possibility that the fires were staged for reasons unknown. But the number of witnesses, the consistency of reports, and the sheer scale of the events challenged every explanation. No one theory accounted for everything, and so the legend remained alive. The house itself eventually became uninhabited. Time has its way of swallowing places like that. The building decayed, its boards weathered, its windows broken by winter storms. When it finally collapsed or was dismantled, the land reclaimed it piece by piece. But the story, the memory of flames rising out of nothing, of investigators baffled, of a frightened girl carrying the weight of something no one understood, that remained. Today, people still talk about the fire spook in low voices, as though repeating the tale might spark something back into existence. Farmers passing the old land speak of a heaviness that hangs there after sundown. Elders recount the fires as though they happened only yesterday. And children, raised on the folklore of the region, know better than to wander too far into the abandoned places where stories like this were born. The Caledonia Mills Fire Spook lives on because it defies closure. It is a reminder that not all mysteries fade with time, that some remain embedded in the land, waiting for someone to retell them. It is a story without an ending but rich with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Whether the phenomenon was supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely, one fact remains: in that quiet rural corner of Nova Scotia, fire once danced without flame, without spark, and without mercy, and a family watched as the world they trusted turned volatile and strange. And though the flames have long since gone out, the memory still burns. I have spent most of my life trying not to speak about the night the Donnellys were killed. In Lucan, silence is a tradition, and we were all raised to believe that certain memories were better left buried, like the bodies of unlucky animals you didn't want the wolves to smell. But the truth has a way of festering in its grave, and as the years have worn me down, I've come to realize that the only thing heavier than a story like this is the weight of never telling it. So let me say it plainly, in the voice I've kept locked away, I was there. I was part of the crowd that walked through the frozen February darkness in 1880, boots sinking into snow crusted with ice, breath rising in clouds that dissolved faster than forgiveness. I didn't strike the blows, but I walked with the men who did, and that has been enough to haunt me for every day of my life. If you've never heard of the Donnellys, or you've only heard the distorted tales whispered by those who prefer ideology to accuracy, then listen closely. What happened to that family was not justice, not even vengeance. It was a fever that took hold of a whole township, a fever that boiled over into bloodshed. And whether we liked it or not, every man who walked that road carried the same sickness inside him. I first met the Donnellys when I was a boy. I remember their farm, ramshackle but proud, carved out of stubborn earth by hands that refused to fail. People spoke of them even then with a mix of admiration and irritation. They were hard people, the kind made by harsh land and harsh times. If you crossed them, you'd hear about it. If they felt wronged, they didn't let it rest. In a place where grudges grew faster than crops, the Donnellys harvested more resentment than most. But I also knew them as neighbors. I shared soup at their table once after getting caught in a storm and losing my way. Mrs. Donnelly had a tired kindness about her, like someone who wanted peace but never quite found the path to it. The boys, James, Tom, John, and Will, were loud, quick-tempered, but not cruel to me. They were men who fought because the world they lived in taught them that softness was a liability. I'm telling you this so you understand. They were not monsters, they were people. Complicated, flawed, stubborn people. And what happened to them was not divine punishment, nor inevitable consequence. It was murder, deliberate, organized, and carried out with a kind of cold certainty that only comes when a whole community decides it would rather spill blood than solve its own problems. I had no desire to join the vigilance committee. My wife begged me to stay out of it, to let the louder men make their noises. But the pressure in a small town is a current you either swim with or drown beneath. The committee framed itself as a force for order. They said the Donnellys were lawless, that they were destroying the township's reputation, that they were a threat to decent folk. Most of it was exaggeration, some of it was outright lies. But once a story gets momentum, truth becomes nothing more than a speed bump. The night it happened, February 4th, 1880, was colder than judgment. I remember standing outside the local hall with the others, listening as men spoke in tight, clipped voices about doing what needs to be done. Even then, I could have walked away. Sometimes I lie awake imagining the version of my life where I did just that. But fear makes strange choices for us. I feared being ostracized more than I feared my own conscience, and so, like a coward, I walked with the mob. I remember the crunch of the snow beneath our feet, the lantern lights bobbing like small, trembling souls in the dark. No one spoke loudly. It was as though we were marching into a church, not a crime. And I suppose in some twisted way, the men believed it was a kind of holy act, the cleansing of a township. I couldn't see it all from where I stood, which is both a mercy and a curse. I saw silhouettes moving wildly, lanterns swinging, and the glow of fire as someone set the outbuildings alight. The Donnellys didn't stand a chance, not against a dozen men, not against a township that had already decided their fate. I remember James Donnelly's voice most clearly, not what he said, but the tone. The sound a man makes when he realizes death is coming from the hands of people he once nodded to on the road. The kind of disbelief that breaks something deeper than bone. I stood there frozen, useless, complicit. The only thing I did all night was refuse a lantern when one of the men tried to hand it to me. That is my badge of honor, my only claim to humanity, and it is worth nothing. Refusing to shine a light on a murder does not absolve you of being there. Inside the house, screams turned to groans, then went silent. When the men emerged, their faces looked twisted in ways I had never seen. Not triumphant, not remorseful, but emptied. Like they had carved away something essential inside themselves and left the pieces on the Donnelly floorboards. We marched next to the home of William Donnelly, the last of the adult sons. This time, I hung even farther back. I already knew what was coming. The others did too, and yet we all kept walking. That is the nature of mob violence. The first act traps you, and the next ones feel inevitable. But fate spared Will. He fled into the snow-covered fields and vanished into the trees before the men could find him. Perhaps it was cowardice on my part, but I prayed he would run fast, run far, run until the land itself swallowed him. By the time we returned to town, dawn had begun to bleed across the sky. News travels fast in a small place. People stood at their doors, pale faces illuminated by the early light. No one asked questions. No one needed to. The truth clung to our clothes like smoke. I went home, washed the blood-spattered snow from my boots, and held my wife while she cried. I told her I hadn't lifted a hand. She told me it didn't matter. She was right. In the days that followed, the township wrapped itself in a shroud of selective amnesia. Some men walked taller, believing they had delivered justice. Others avoided one another's eyes. The trials came, but predictably, they ended in acquittals. No one saw anything. No one remembered. The silence that settled over Lucan was thicker than the snowdrifts outside. People claim nature abhors a vacuum. I can assure you, a small town does not. It thrives on one. It fills the gaps with fear and half-truths until nothing remains but a version of events that allows everyone to sleep at night. Except me. I have carried the Donnellys with me through every season since. I see them in the corners of my memory. James with his fiery temper but fierce loyalty. Tom with his rough humor. Mrs. Donnelly with her tired smile. I see the injustice of it all, the way collective hatred can make good men cruel and ordinary men into accomplices. I see how fragile the boundary is between a community and a mob. People still tell the story of the Black Donnellys. They tell it with embellishments, with dramatic flair, with accusations that shift like shadows depending on who is speaking. But very few tell it with honesty. Very few admit that it wasn't the Donnellys alone who were at fault, but the whole township, including me. And so I speak now, in the hope that saying the truth, after all these years, might ease the burden I've carried. I speak because the dead deserve more than the silence we gave them. I speak because memory is the only justice left. The Donnellys were not saints, but they did not deserve to die the way they did. No one does. The night of the massacre taught me something I have never forgotten. The greatest horror in a small town is not the ghost stories told by firelight, nor the legends whispered by children. It is the moment when ordinary men allow themselves to believe that violence is easier than understanding, that hatred is simpler than compromise, and that a family, any family, can become an enemy simply by being different. I was there. I saw what happened, and I will carry it with me until my final breath, because the dead cannot speak for themselves, and the living rarely speak the truth. It's mine. If you have ever walked along the marshlands near modern-day Wallaceburg, you may have felt it without knowing why. A thinness to the air, a hush in the reeds, a watchfulness hidden somewhere between the river's slow pulse and the whispering wheat fields. Some places carry stories the way a tree carries rings, each year etched deeper into the grain. And Baldoon, that strange little corner of early Upper Canada, carries a story so old and so stubborn that the land still flinches with its memory. People call it the Baldoon Mystery, but those who have heard the story from the lips of the old ones know it was not a mystery so much as a haunting that stretched itself across seasons and generations, weaving terror into the daily lives of ordinary settlers until nothing felt natural anymore. The story begins with the MacDonald family, hardy Scottish immigrants who came to carve out a life from the tangled frontier. They settled on land that looked promising enough, fertile soil, good water, a wide sky free of mountains and cliffs. To them, it must have seemed like a new beginning, a way to leave behind the hardships of the old country. But the land they chose had a memory older than their arrival, and some said it never truly welcomed them. The first signs were small. An animal found dead in the morning, though it had been healthy the night before. A cow refusing to move from the barn as though invisible hands held it back. The sound of tapping on the walls at night, rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone were counting down to something only they understood. The MacDonalds were practical people, not prone to superstition, and so they brushed these incidents aside with the ease of settlers who had far more pressing problems. But the land was not done with them. The tapping grew louder, sharper, faster. Shadows flitted across the walls, even when no lamps were lit. Footsteps circled the house long after every door was bolted. The family heard voices in the yard when no one was there, low murmurs threading their way through the crops as though the fields themselves were whispering. Still, the family endured. They planted, they worked, they prayed, but the strange occurrences multiplied until even prayer felt small. One night, with no cause and no warning, stones began to fall upon the house. Not pebbles, not handfuls, but stones, heavy, solid, thrown with such force that they split the wooden shingles and rattled the windows in their frames. The family rushed outside, lanterns raised against the dark, but found no one in the fields, no footprints in the soil, no sign of human mischief. The stone rain continued for days. The MacDonalds grew afraid, not of a person, for no person could have thrown stones with such precision night after night without being seen. They feared something else, something watching them from a place just beyond the edge of vision. Something old, patient, and hungry. The fires came next. It began with a small blaze in the corner of the barn. The family stamped it out quickly, but then another fire sprang up in the house. And then another, and another. Fires sparked on the bed straw. Fires flared along the walls. Fires ignited in the yard where no spark should ever have existed. They were small but relentless, occurring so often that the family no longer slept, taking turns keeping watch through the long, anxious nights. The fires were not natural. They began without cause and ended without explanation. Even the animals grew strange. Horses bolted with no rider. Chickens refused to roost. A pig, normally docile, screamed for hours at the empty doorway as though it saw something there no human could see. The McDonalds sought help for neighbors, but the neighbors grew frightened too. Visitors reported feeling watched the moment they crossed onto the property. Some claimed to hear whispers in languages they did not know. Others refused to set foot near the farm at all. The family consulted ministers, thinking perhaps prayer might break the spell. Ministers came, recited scripture, sprinkled holy water, and watched helplessly as objects lifted from shelves and flew across the room. One minister, a man known for his fearlessness, fled after witnessing stones fall inside the house without any visible source. Word spread. People talked about witchcraft. Others spoke of a curse. A few whispered that the land itself was angry, that something had been disturbed when the farmhouse was built. No one could agree on the cause, but everyone agreed on one point: the Baldoon farm had become unlivable. The family grew desperate. They sought help from anyone willing to give it, even those considered strange or unconventional. It was then that someone told them of an elderly woman who lived miles away, a woman said to have knowledge of unseen forces. Some called her wise, others called her dangerous, but when terror reaches a certain point, one will reach for any hand that extends. So the McDonalds went to her. The woman listened to their story with a calm that unnerved them. When they finished, she nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had suspected long before they arrived. "This is not a ghost," she told them. "This is not the work of the dead. This is the work of the living, or what is left of the living." She told them there was a shape-shifting witch behind their misfortune, a witch who had taken the form of a black goose, and she warned them that they would never find peace until the witch was wounded in a way that forced her to reveal her true human body. She handed them a special bullet, a lead ball melted down from silver coins, shaped by fire and whispered over with words the McDonalds did not recognize. She told them to wait for the black goose. Not any goose, but the one that would not take flight when the others did. The McDonalds returned home and waited. Days passed. The tapping, the fires, the stones, all continued as though mocking their efforts. But then, one morning, a flock of geese wandered into their yard. The family approached, guns ready. The geese scattered into the air with frantic flapping, all except one. The black goose stood still. It turned its head and stared at them, unblinking, as though daring them to act. The air thickened around it. The family felt the weight of something ancient pressing against their chests. They fired the bullet. The goose staggered, one wing dropping to its side. Then it ran, faster than any wounded creature should. It disappeared into the reeds, leaving behind a trail of feathers. The family followed, but the trail led only to the home of a woman who had long been rumored to harbor ill will, a woman with a deep scratch on her arm, still bleeding, fresh and jagged. After that day, the stones stopped. The fires went out, the tapping ceased, the animals calmed. The house settled into a silence so complete, it felt like the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The Baldoon Mystery faded with time, but it was never forgotten. People told the story with variations. Some believed the witch explanation, others believed the land had been cursed, and still others believed the entire tale was a testament to what fear can do to the human mind. But the McDonalds never contradicted any version. They would only say that before the bullet was fired, chaos ruled their lives, and after it was fired, peace returned. They provided no further explanation. Today, the land where the farmhouse once stood carries no sign of the old terror. But those who walk there sometimes say the air feels different, lighter in some places, heavier in others. And some claim that, on particularly quiet evenings, you can still hear a faint tapping on the wind, like knuckles on wood, growing slower with each passing year. The Baldoon Mystery lives on because it is more than a haunting. It is a reminder that not everything in this world bends to reason. Some stories take root, not because they can be proven, but because they refuse to die, and the land remembers, always. There are stories that come to you like drifting smoke, thin and shifting, and there are stories that sink into your blood, heavy as iron. The story of the Dungarvan Whooper is the latter. It is not the sort of tale one picks up casually, nor the kind one forgets after hearing it once. It is a story carved into the forests of New Brunswick, pressed into the cold earth of the Miramichi, and whispered through the towering pines that still guard the logging camps like ancient sentinels. Some call it legend. Others swear it is history. I call it something else entirely, a truth wrapped in mystery, a truth I have spent a lifetime trying not to acknowledge. Because the Whooper is more than a scream in the night or a ghost in a campfire tale. It is the echo of something undone, something left without justice, something buried in shallow ground beneath trees that never cared who lived or died beneath their shadows. I first heard the story from an old lumberman, a man with hands scarred enough to tell half the tale for him. He spoke quietly, as though the woods themselves were listening, and maybe they were. In that part of the world, the woods have their own kind of memory. They keep accounts in ways humans never quite manage. He told me of a young cook named Ryan, a quiet, hard-working fellow who joined a lumber camp along the Dungarvan River during a particularly bitter winter. Ryan was not a fighting man. He was not the sort who drank himself into trouble or boasted of conquests that never happened. He was simply a boy who needed work, who carried his father's old belt and his mother's last gift, a little bundle of money tied tightly and strapped around his waist, his only wealth in a world where winter could starve a man faster than poverty. The camp was rough and filled with men who feared boredom more than death. They worked the saws, felled the great pines, and lived in crude shacks where stories and tempers grew alongside the snowdrifts. Into this world walked Ryan, soft-spoken and careful, carrying pots and pans without complaint. Most men liked him well enough. He fed them after all, and in a lumber camp, a cook is half the heart of the place. But there was one man, a foreman of sorts, though he bore no official title, who watched Ryan too closely, eyed him too long, and spoke with a slant of envy whenever Ryan's money belt caught the light. No one can say whether greed or madness took him first. Some say he had debts. Others say the woods whispered to him, urging him toward darker impulses. Whatever it was, it happened fast. One day, while the rest of the men were deep in the forest, cutting timber beneath a white sky that seemed to stretch forever, Ryan remained at camp, preparing the evening meal. The foreman stayed behind too. When the men returned and the snow had thickened under their boots, they found no dinner waiting, no smoke rising from the chimney, no lively clang of pots. They found only the foreman standing stiff and pale by the door of the cookhouse. He told them Ryan had died suddenly, dropped without warning. Some sickness, he claimed, something that came on fast. Men in the woods know death intimately, and they know its signs. But they also know when something feels wrong. Still, with daylight fading and cold creeping toward their bones, they did the only thing they could do. They buried Ryan quickly in the frozen ground behind the camp, the way men buried many others in those days, with haste, with tired hands, with little ceremony. The foreman stood over the grave. Some say his face was tight with guilt. Others say it was blank. But all agreed on one thing. Ryan's money belt was nowhere to be found. Night fell early, as winter nights do. The men lay in bunks that creaked under their weight, listening to the sighing wind slip through the cracks of the cookhouse. And then they heard it, a sound unlike anything that belonged to man or beast. It rose from the direction of Ryan's grave, a long, piercing wail that curled through the trees like smoke from a fire that should have been put out. It was a cry filled with fury, with betrayal, with the raw wound of a life stolen too soon. It was not just a scream, it was a demand. The men froze, hearts pounding. Some prayed. Others gripped their blankets like lifelines. But no one slept. Through the dawn, the whooper's scream, for they had already given it a name, rolled through the woods. It echoed off the trunks of ancient red spruce, traveled the icy stretches of the Dungarvan River, and settled into the bones of every man who heard it. They knew then that Ryan's death had not been natural. They knew the foreman had taken something more than a life. They knew the land itself had rejected the injustice. The next day, when the sun did little to warm the snow, the men confronted the foreman. Some said he trembled, others said he grew defensive. But whatever happened in those heated minutes is lost to history, swallowed by the quiet pact of men who understood that some truths were too heavy to record. By midday, the foreman had fled the camp, disappearing into the dense woods with the desperation of a man being hunted. The screaming did not stop. All through the night, and the next, the whooper wailed from the grave, a sound that rose and fell like the beating of a wounded heart. It drove the men half mad. They abandoned their posts, gathered their belongings, and left the camp behind, swearing they would never return. Some claimed they saw a figure in the trees, tall and thin, watching with eyes that burned like coal. Others spoke of hearing footsteps crunching in the snow behind them, keeping pace no matter how fast they walked. The camp was never the same. Lumber crews refused to come near it. The place was said to be cursed, haunted, marked. The grave remained shallow and lonely until a priest was summoned, a man with more courage than most. He performed rites over the burial, spoke blessings into the silent frost, and prayed for mercy on the soul that had screamed so violently into the world of the living. After that, the whooper quieted, but he did not disappear. Travelers through the Miramichi woods, especially those who wandered near the old camp, reported hearing the wail on certain nights, long after the last lumberman had left the place behind. The sound carried across the river, slipping through campfires and turning laughter into silence. It was said that the whooper cried hardest during snowstorms, as though the cold reminded him of the night he met his fate. Some believe the whooper still calls out for justice. Others think he calls for the foreman who stole his life. A few say he calls simply to be remembered, refusing to let the forest bury him twice. I cannot say which version is true, but I can tell you this: the whooper's voice is not just a story. It is the echo of something violated, something that refuses to stay quiet beneath the earth. I have heard it once, only once, and it was enough. I was traveling the old logging route at dusk with a companion who had no patience for ghost tales. The woods were heavy that evening, pressing close around us, the trees leaning inward as though they wished to listen to something we could not hear. We had made camp when the wind died suddenly. The fire seemed to shrink as though pulled inward by invisible hands. And then the sound came. Not a wolf, not an owl, not anything this world claims as its own. It was a scream that tore through the sky like a blade tearing cloth. It began low, rose sharply, and then carried out across the river in a trembling wail that felt like it pierced the air itself. My companion froze. I froze. The sound did not belong to the living. It came from someplace older, deeper, and lonelier. It was the sound of injustice refusing to die. We left before dawn. Neither of us spoke. The forest seemed to close behind us, returning to its eternal silence. And though I have walked many woods since then, none have felt as watchful as the Miramichi. None have carried the weight of a story so unfinished. People still tell the tale of the Dungarvan whooper by firelight, usually with laughter afterward to drive away the chill. But those who have heard the real cry know better. They know the whooper is not a legend designed to frighten children. He is the memory of a wrong that was never set right, a ghost bound not by death, but by betrayal. And so the whooper remains, in the wind, in the river, in the restless nights when the forest feels too still. His voice rises when the snow is thickest and the moon is at its thinnest, and if you listen closely enough, you might hear what the old lumbermen claimed they heard, a cry that begins in grief, swells with fury, and ends with a question. A question that has never been answered, a question the forest still holds. That is the Dungarvan whooper, not a tale, not a warning, but a reminder that some stories refuse to be buried even when the grave is deep.